Will a ceasefire hostage release deal brokered by the Trump administration allow Hamas to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Is the IDF too exhausted and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu too worn down by U.S. pressure and domestic critics to continue the fight to ensure that there will never again be another October 7th? Or is the U.S.-Israel alliance and Trump's backing for Israel going to prove once again sufficiently strong as it did in the struggle against Iran's nuclear program to ensure that whatever comes next, it won't allow the genocidal Islamist group to survive? Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an interesting conversation for you with the Israeli military analyst Elliot Chodoff about what's next in the war against Hamas and other Iranian terrorist proxies. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The world is still holding its breath, waiting to see if, as many expect in the coming days, a new ceasefire hostage release deal will be announced, bringing the war in Gaza to at least a temporary halt. Speculation about the terms of such a deal were only heightened by the fact that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's recent visit to Washington to meet with President Trump produced no announcements or credible clues about what will happen next. The problem for Israel is essentially the same as it's been since the start of the war that began with the Hamas-led Palestinian assault on Israel and the unspeakable atrocities of October 7th. The Jewish state's twin war goals of destroying Hamas and freeing all of the hostages remain mutually exclusive. There is no chance that Hamas will free all of the hostages as part of any agreement that forces it to lay down its arms and the remaining terrorists leave the country. Indeed, it's hard to believe that anything short of a complete Israeli surrender, which lets Hamas go back to governing Gaza as an independent Palestinian terror state in all but name, would be enough to tempt the Islamist group to release all of the hostages and the bodies of dead Israelis that they carried away after October 7th. And even then, the bitter truth is that this genocidal organization might still hang on to some of them. But that raises the question of whether, even if the Trump administration remains solidly behind the effort to finally eradicate Hamas, if it is a goal that is achievable under any circumstances, or if the IDF is too exhausted by 22 months of warfare to accomplish it. Then there's the question of whether Netanyahu can count on continued support from the Israeli public to carry on the struggle. Moreover, the dilemma facing the government raises other questions about the way the war against Hamas has been fought, and if the successes the Jewish state achieved by defeating Hezbollah and Iran have been or can be matched in the conflict against Hamas in Gaza. Is the Israeli economy and the political system still strong enough to carry on the struggle? Or is Netanyahu, as well as Israel itself, headed inevitably to an unsatisfactory outcome to the post-October 7th war? And what lies ahead for Israel with respect to Lebanon, Syria, and the ongoing conflict with Iran? One person who has done a great deal of thinking about all of this is Elliot Chodoff, one of the keenest minds analyzing the IDF, as well as thinking about Israel's future. Elliot Chodoff is a political and military strategic analyst specializing on Israel and the global war on terrorists. A military sociologist who was taught at the University of Haifa for 25 years, he is also a major in the IDF reserves and currently writes Doctrine for Cohesion and Combat Effectiveness in Reserve Units, and hosts the Conflict Uncovered podcast. Elliot Chodoff, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well, Elliot, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the current negotiations over a possible ceasefire hostage release deal with Hamas. We don't know for sure whether an agreement is likely or what its final terms will be. But the question here is, how can Israel agree to something that will allow Hamas to remain in Gaza and presumably able to control at least part of it going forward, without admitting that it has failed to achieve one of its two main war goals after 21 months of fighting?
It can't. And very simply, it can split the difference in the sense that one of the goals was to destroy Hamas's ability to, for lack of a better term, to repeat an October 7th kind of attack. That's been accomplished. Now, will it be maintained indefinitely is a different kind of a question. But if we take a snapshot of where we are sitting at the moment, Hamas's military capability, in other words, the ability to put thousands of terrorists, rockets, drones, and the like into southern Israel, is simply gone. What has happened is that Hamas has been reduced, and this happened months ago, to a guerrilla organization, if you will, driving it back, let's say, 20 plus years in terms of its capability. It still has
prior
terrorist...
to 2007, in other words, when it took over.
Yes, even prior to 2005, to the disengagement. In other words, it is still alive. It still has terrorist capability, as we're seeing in Judea and Samaria, and as we're seeing in its combat capability against the IDF in Gaza. But it's very, very small, very, very localized. I'm not belittling it, but I'm just trying to put it into a sense of relative scale. So preventing it from coming back is really about enforcing the aftermath of an agreement rather than the agreement itself. We have to take for granted, based on history, that they are going to lie, cheat, and steal from the moment any agreement has come to it, and from our even recent experience, violate it even before it goes into effect. We've seen that as well. And at that point, I think it's up to Israel, and certainly the IDF and other security services, to essentially do what we're doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is to say, we will not tolerate even the smallest violation, and we'll go after it. Now, that's not 100%, but it certainly puts you way ahead of the curve, as opposed to what we've done in the past.
Better that Israel has done in
years.
the past, where it basically,
exactly,
it let them do what they wanted.
Right. Well, what we've done in the past, and they're aware of this, is play basically an incremental, permissive game, which psychologically makes a lot of sense, and in short-term politics makes a lot of sense. In other words, this isn't about stupid; it's about wrong. To say, well, okay, are we going to go to war because they've fired 2 rockets? Are we going to go to war because they've built a position along the border? Are we going to go to war, let's say, with Hezbollah because they've moved a few terrorists into an area that they're not supposed to be in? And that kind of incremental, I call it the auctioneer's mentality. Are you going to let this $5,000 item get away for $20? And so on. Something we're no longer doing with Hezbollah, and I would hope that we wouldn't do with Hamas as well. So the agreement could possibly fall short of our sort of grand demands, but it could be a workable one in terms of achieving other objectives, like getting the hostages back. And there again, that depends on all sorts of details that I don't believe an agreement is in until it's agreed on. I don't buy this. We're close to an agreement. It's binary. Either you have one or you don't. But if there's an agreement that brings back the hostages, and I'm talking about all the hostages, then we've achieved that objective. We've achieved the partial in the other category that we talked about. I think that's workable. Optimal? Absolutely not, but workable.
All right. Well, if we take it as a given, as I think you and I believe, that the eradication of Hamas and freeing all of the hostages have always been mutually exclusive goals. If Israel is choosing the latter rather than the former right now, I guess the question that has to be asked, and some obviously critics of the Netanyahu government are asking it, Was the last year or more of fighting necessary? What has the IDF accomplished in its efforts in Gaza, say over the last 12 months or more, that justifies the sacrifices in terms of, blood spilled as well as political capital expended?
A few things. And, justification of cost versus benefit is short of absolute victory is always a tough call.
Right.
But we've certainly done a huge amount of damage to Hamas in the past year, over and above what was done prior. Physical as well as manpower, taking out leadership, destroying further infrastructure, and everything destroyed, once again, if it's held, and we hold them to it, is a setback for them. We've driven them to the point where they want to come to an agreement. But we should also understand that they're not giving up. In other words, the ultimate victory of surrender is where we're short. We're certainly still taking out leaders. We're obviously lower rank than the ones we took out before. They don't have many high-ranking leaders left in Gaza. So there's been a lot of additional damage done to them, and that's a further setback. In other words, if we were to arrive at an agreement now, we arrive at one in a much better position power-wise, because power is always relative, power-wise relative to them than we would have, let's say, a year ago. It also makes, given the additional destruction in Gaza, and there's been significant destruction in Gaza, it makes the victory parades that we know we're going to see, just as we saw in Tehran.
Hamas victory parades.
Yes, right. Just as we saw in Tehran after the ceasefire there, it'll make it that much more hollow than it would have been a year ago. I mean, they can put on their show. The question is, even within Gaza and certainly from the outside, are people going to look, as we did watching the Tehran parades, and just shake our heads and say, okay, this is theater, it's very nice, but they know as well as we do that it has no contact and relation to reality.
Yeah, well, I guess, that the question that was raised, the New York Times did a, major piece this past weekend about claiming Ronan Bergman, veteran reporter, was the principal author, claiming that the continuation of the war was solely about politics. I guess, I'm not asking you to make a political judgment, which is always relative, but I guess what you're telling us is that there were real strategic and tactical goals being pursued here. It wasn't just politics, even if politics played a part in it.
First of all, politics plays a part in everything. That's
war is politics by other means. Yes,
right. Okay, von Clausewitz. The actual quote is war is politics by addition, an extension of politics by additional means.
Right.
And he said politics. He didn't mean international strategy necessarily. It could also be domestic, and it doesn't have to be within a democracy. Dictatorships and monarchies also have politics. So you can't, this idea that you can divorce war from politics simply flies in the face of all war theory that I know to operate in. I've only been a strategist for about 4.5 decades. There is no such thing as war without politics. So that's number one. Number two, the idea that you can operate within, and certainly within, a parliamentary democracy and ignore domestic political. America is not a parliamentary democracy, and it can't ignore domestic politics. In a parliamentary one, you can have your government can fall over it, which means that even if you make a decision that is, let's say, for the purposes of the Times article, to end the war, and your government falls and you can't enforce it, what have you gained by it? So the idea that it's purely about personal politics, and I think that's really the issue. And here I've got to say, as an aside, and I don't usually make an ad hominem argument, but Ronan Bergman finds Bibi Netanyahu responsible for everything, including the weather, which is why I don't particularly put a lot of weight into his analysis.
But he's clearly operating with the help of people within the intelligence establishment who are leaking to him. He's the author of some books that are considered authoritative about the history of Israeli intelligence. He's got a lot of sources there who have political goals of their own, don't they?
They absolutely do. Everybody does. Let's also keep in mind, with all due respects to the intelligence community, they're not perfect. See note October 7th, see note Yom Kippur War. I can mention a few more, but I think you get my point. They're very good. And here, I don't want to denigrate the Israeli intelligence community. They do an outstanding job. But to turn their words or analysis necessarily into, graven in stone and handed down in Sinai is a mistake. And I mean, as a personal aside, I'm not an intelligence officer. I'm a consumer as a reserve officer and staff officer.
A consumer of their intelligence, yes.
Yeah. I know to take it seriously, but also with a certain grain of salt. In other words, a good operations planner takes the intelligence and doesn't use it verbatim. It's okay, there's a strong basis, but what else do I know? What's missing? Where could they have possibly made a mistake? And that goes into planning as well. And I think that's also an important aspect of this. So Bergman certainly has his sources. He's certainly quoting the ones that suit him, and I think that's an important point. And to the absence of the ones who don't. So this idea of laying it all at Netanyahu's feet, other than the buck stops here as prime minister, which I think is a fair point to make, but the idea that he's doing it for personal reasons and personal political survival and that sort of thing is taking it way too far. Mm-hmm. Add one other point to this, and we see this in the sort of real-time decision-making of both success and failure. And I'll start with the success one, because we all have 20/20 hindsight. The opening strike on Iran was brilliant. It was as perfect as a military operation at scale could be. But that's after the fact. Going in, you don't know that's going to be the case. And the same thing is true in the inverse. In other words, you plan an operation, let's say in Gaza, and it doesn't work as well as planned. And this one is not working as well as planned. I think we should be very clear. It's not failing. It's not a defeat. But it's not delivering the goods that we would have liked to have seen delivered. Mm-hmm. Many of them, but not all of them. You don't know that until you've done it. And then you can do the post-mortem and say, okay, well, why didn't this work? And why didn't that work? And what didn't we take into account? And what assessments did we make that were not wrong, but not right? Because there's a lot of gray in between. And I think that the commentaries that are based on post-mortem, if you will, historical, have the tendency to err in the 20/20 hindsight direction and say, they should have known this, they should have done this, which is all very clever, but it's not how it works in the real world.
Yeah, it's also the sort of the fallacy of the assumed conclusion, and that
yes.
you don't know what's going to happen. That's counterfactuals are interesting because right. We walk into history walking backwards. We don't see
exactly.
it, and I think it's a military proverb that no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Correct.
So of course it's all in hindsight, and there's a tendency to assume that whatever happened was always going to happen, but that's not really the case.
It's not really the case, and there is a tendency for many reasons, and this is in the doctrinal literature, that when you plan and actually go into a military operation, you tend to be more optimistic than reality.
Yeah, very soon. We'll get back to the IDF's military successes or failures in a moment. But I want to ask you about the latest proposal being aired for Gaza, which is about moving all or most of the Palestinians in Gaza to a humanitarian cities, presumably in the Gaza Strip and the Rafah area. Do you think this is any more viable than Trump's talk of building a resort there, or is this something that can and even should happen?
I don't think that it can happen, and I think its weak spot is the same weak spot that Trump's plan had. And that's not where will they go, because here it's obvious where they would go, but Trump's plan of them going to some other country or countries had a certain weakness to it, but I don't think that's the real failure point. The failure point is that Hamas is not going to permit it. And here, I think it's important to understand, we talked about earlier the destruction of Hamas's sort of higher military capability, which has succeeded. In other words, on October 7th, and in the aftermath of October 7th, when we went into Gaza, we were facing a Hamas of brigades and battalions, a military-style organization. I don't want to give them too much credit, but it was still a military-style organization. That has been smashed. There are two levels below that. The one that we're fighting, which is the guerrilla organization, and again, we can talk about what that means, but take that now as a given. But there's a level below that as well, which is going to be even more difficult to dismantle. I call it the thug organization. In other words, these are the people who are maintaining control as much as they can over the population in Gaza. They are a loose-knit, very, very small, they may be large, but they don't need to be a large group of dozens or hundreds of thugs with Kalashnikov assault rifles who are willing to shoot people in the streets. And they've done it. And they do it, spectacularly with videoing and putting it out. So those are the people who will prevent the mass movement of a population into the humanitarian area. We can't even get them out of Gaza City now, the ones who've gone back after the ceasefire, for a variety of reasons, but including that Hamas is in there and telling them, if you go, we're going to shoot you. And to think that we're going to move 1 million people into a humanitarian area when Hamas is going to say, if you move, we're going to kill you and your family, and they're credible. I don't see it happen.
Yeah. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu is operating under tremendous domestic pressure, as well as that which is coming from abroad. Is any softening in Israel's position on Hamas as much the result of the fatigue that has set in within the IDF, which was not built for this kind of a long war, with the reserves being mobilized for so long a time, as it is, the political demands, from some of the hostage families and from Netanyahu's political opponents to end the war now? What's really pushing him to, other than, wanting to please Trump from the domestic end? What's the more important factor here?
I don't know if there's a more important and less important as much as it's a conglomerate. In other words, ranking it, I think, is an interesting intellectual exercise. But there's no question that the IDF is fatigued. The troops are. The IDF is not geared to fight a multi-year, high-intensity conflict. In my opinion, in addition to everything else, and here, let me start by saying that the troops on the ground has, for the most part, overwhelmingly, been brilliant in their execution, in their learning curve as they go. But the management level, and here I'm not even talking about strategy as much as manpower management, equipment management, munitions management, has not been as good as it could be. I have a great deal of criticism, and we're beginning to see the results of that. So what's essentially happened is not only fatigue, which is only going to get worse, but what I consider to be
the brunt of the war is being actually carried by a relatively small number of people, isn't it? The people in the fighting units who keep getting called up, repeatedly, as well as the regular army. That puts enormous pressure on a relatively few people.
Yes. So first of all, it's enormous pressure from multiple directions: family, economic, business, employers, and the like. Disruption of life, the uncertainty. This is even before we get into the dangerous combat. I'm just talking about the reality of being called up for 300 or 400 days and going home and coming back and going home and coming back and that sort of thing. But in addition to that, we have simply combat fatigue. we're seeing the results of that. In my opinion, many of the casualties, and I don't want to go into precision because once again, it's hard to say with absolute certainty, but many of the casualties that we've seen over the past few weeks are at least in part a result of that fatigue. Fatigue makes you sloppy. Fatigue takes your focus away, and these are things that are deadly on the battlefield. Guerrilla warfare is low intensity in terms of combat violence, but extremely high intensity in terms of its psychological effect, the need to be that much more focused. Just a simple example from one extreme to another, finding a tank brigade as it's coming to attack you, that's a lot of violence, but it doesn't take a lot of work to find it. 3 terrorists with an RPG require a huge amount of focus to catch them before they kill a couple of your people. And that we're there as well. So I think we've gone into a place where the cost and benefit curves of the operation have crossed. In other words, we're paying too high a price for too little return in fighting this guerrilla organization. By the way, I think they know it, which is why they're toughening their negotiating stance. I mean, that's part of it as well. They're willing to hold out for another week or 2 or 3 or 4 and gain a few more points in the negotiations. So we would probably be best off strategically to wind this down now and rebuild, get everybody back, up and on track, prepare the military for a guerrilla war, which it is not prepared for in terms of proper use of equipment. I think armor is not being used in the best possible way under the circumstances. This requires doctrinal revision, training, preparation, exercise, and they've been doing it on the fly. I just want to say one more time, for an army to have learned all of this on the fly as well as the IDF did is amazing. But still, it's not good enough under the circumstances.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, of course, arguably the IDF wasn't really prepared for the war that had already fought against Hamas's military formations.
Correct.
Not merely just the fact that they were surprised on October 7th, but just the urban warfare, the intense, putting in the infantry.
Yes.
As someone who has been to Israel many, many times in recent years, was given the tour of the Gaza border many times, and it was all about technology and all about people sitting in closed areas, not on the border, with binoculars and ready
and
with
TV
a firearm, but sitting there with a joystick and looking at a video screen. That kind of warfare didn't prevail after October 7th, and now now you're saying that the war they learned to fight on the fly, now they have to learn to fight another kind of war, which perhaps an earlier generation of IDF fighters, go back to, sort of what happened in Gaza in the early 70s when Ariel Sharon was, the head of the Southern Command fighting a guerrilla war against, I guess the PLO then, not, long before Hamas was created.
Yes.
They have to relearn those lessons.
Correct. What's happened, infantry warfare in the classic form is the lowest tech type of warfare. It's the least glamorous. And while we certainly venerate our infantry forces, and rightly so, the high-tech allure of the drones and the joysticks and the screens and all of that certainly had its impact. And I should say, parenthetically, it's something that I've been screaming against for a couple of decades in the IDF. And fortunately, I would say, the infantry forces were still trained in the basics. So when push came to shove, they were able to make that switch. And here technology has its place. The drones have had enormous benefit in terms of using for reconnaissance, for taking out targets and that sort of thing. But still, when push comes to shove, the people on the ground who are actually maneuvering are the ones who are taking the ground and holding it. And that was something that the IDF had, as a system, had kind of taken out of its thinking. And that has to be put back in and then brought down in scale another level when you're dealing with guerrilla warfare, because now suddenly you're not facing platoons and companies and battalions, but again, 3 guys, 4 guys, 5 guys popping up out of a hole, taking a couple of shots, killing somebody and disappearing.
Yeah, that's a completely different thing. Now, we've already discussed the New York Times, its major feature in the last week, claiming to prove that Netanyahu prolonged the war for political reasons. But, we haven't really talked much about Israel's economy. That plays into the part with the reserves, because there are hundreds of thousands of people who have, been away from their jobs for most of the last 2 years, had their salaries paid. Israel's more or less printing money now to balance its budget. Does the economy need a break from the war too, or how does it? And in the end, how does it pay for the increased cost of everything that's happened in the last 21 months?
The economy certainly needs a break. I would say not as precipitously or as urgently, but it'll need it. I mean, ultimately, somebody's going to have to pay the bills on this. And it's going to be us.
Israel's been living on credit for most of its life. Let's concede that much.
Yes, it has. But this was an enormous jump. And also, let's keep in mind, we're talking about an economy that was doing amazingly well before. In other words, the standard of living in the country is very high, and remains so. But we've begun to see price increases. I don't think that we've seen the end of them. I think we're seeing only the very beginning. We're going to see an inflation, perhaps an enforced war bond kind of a situation in taxation, because once again, ultimately, when all the dust settles, someone is going to have to pay the bill on this, and it's going to be us for the rest of our lives and our children and perhaps our grandchildren.
And Israelis are already taxed, at almost confiscatory levels.
Yes.
Even after the reforms of the last couple of decades, the remains of the old East German economic model, that was put in place by the labor Zionists who helped build Israel, that's still there, isn't it?
It's still there. Remnants of it for sure are still there. Less than it was, absolutely, but we're a very highly taxed society. And when you add the impact of reserve duty, there's hidden taxation built into the system as we all become part of the system. So, just to give you an example, I was in the reserves today. I had a meeting. I will get some reimbursement for the day, not anywhere near what I would take for a normal day's work. But nobody's going to pay my gas. In other words, I have to subsidize my reserve service directly and indirectly along the way. Now, that doesn't appear in the defense budget. And I'm a simple case, because I just went somewhere to go for a bunch of meetings. When back in the day when I would go into the field, it also meant buying equipment for myself, making sure I had spare things, because those of us who've been doing this for years know, with all due respect to the IDF, it does not supply you with everything you need. It supplies you with the minimum of what you need. Where does the gap? Who closes the gap? We do. And that's a hidden taxation. As I said, it's part of the defense budget that doesn't appear in any of the government's reports.
Yeah. Well, if the war is drawing to a close, the recriminations over who is responsible for October 7th will heat up, with many asking why Israel was so well informed about Hezbollah and Iran, as we've seen, in the last, several months, but not Hamas. But isn't it also important for the IDF to understand where they succeeded and failed, not only on that terrible day, but in the war they fought after that? What do you think were the IDF's worst mistakes in the last 21 months? And at least as far as Gaza is concerned, what were its greatest successes?
Okay, so first of all, I would say the worst mistakes were the ones that were prior to October 7th. Doctrinal mistakes, organizational mistakes, and I'm not even talking about the immediate Hamas was deterred mistake. That was an assessment error. I'm talking about
an assessment that was frankly shared across the, as far as I knew, with a few exceptions. Pretty much everybody across the board in Israel's political leadership, in the government and opposed to the government, all shared the same mistaken assumptions, didn't they?
Yes, because everybody thought that Hamas were a bunch of rational economic actors whose interest was to economic stability. And no, we have a hard time in the West understanding radical Islamic ideology. And if you don't plug that into your assessment, you're going to come up with the wrong answer. But I'm saying leaving that aside, doctrinal errors of reducing the size of the military, reducing the number of tanks in tank brigades, cutting back on reserve service and reserve unit training, relying more on technology and less on troops on the ground. I can go on, but I think the point here is that the errors were systemic. They were conceptual in the grand military strategic sense, and the assessment error, as I'll call it, saying that Hamas was deterred, simply played into that. But that was sort of the immediate failure, not the grand one. The Gaza division should have been able, at full strength, to stop the Hamas attack, even if it were a surprise attack. The problem is the Gaza division had been reduced to a third of the strength that it had been prior to the disengagement in 2005. But it was still called a division. Okay, so there was a certain sort of built-in bluff that on the map, on the charts, it said division, but in reality, it was less than brigade. So those are the deep errors as far as I'm concerned. The bounce back of the IDF was nothing short of miraculous. In large part because of the reservists, but not exclusively. And it's the IDF's ability to mobilize, go into the field, train up to close gaps that had been along the way, and then to go in here. And we can, even talking today, we're 800 plus dead casualties since the outbreak of the war, and everyone is a tragedy. We lost three more soldiers yesterday in Gaza. If we put that number against the 25 or 30,000 Hamas terrorists that we've killed, we understand that the performance of the IDF has been incredible. So a lot of good, a lot of innovation on the ground, and I can go into some of the details, but in terms of joint maneuvers, of using special forces mixed in with the regular forces and improving both along the way, the coordination between the air and the ground and the different branches on the ground, not to be taken for granted, and done very, very well. In terms of failure, what I mentioned before, I think the management of the war leaves a lot to be desired. In other words, going in, it should have been already understood that we're not looking at a 6-day war, and we're not looking at a 2-week war and a 5-week war. We're looking at something very long. And I think the best analogy that I can use is a runner's analogy. If you're used to running 100-yard dashes and 220s and 440s, and you suddenly find yourself in a marathon and you don't stop and realign all your thinking, you're going to run out pretty fast and you're going to be out of breath a couple of miles in.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about, failures and these successes. But, I guess when I speak to people in the Israeli military, when I've been there and when they've come here in the United States, the message I've gotten consistently was that the lower ranks and the junior officers performed brilliantly. But if there were failures during this war, it was the failure of the generals. The generals were the ones who kind of misused the the forces that they had, they were not only not prepared, but they didn't fight the post-October 7th war with the same, brilliance that people, expected from the IDF. How do you grade the generals? I know you're a major, you're right there in the middle, but
Yes.
how did the IDF's general staff and its commanders do in this war?
Okay, so once again, if we're talking about generals, divisional commanders, and our brigades are commanded by colonels, so I'll throw them into the mix. Generally very, very good, even excellent. In other words, the men who commanded the field troops, even on the higher levels, did the job. Nobody's perfect. Very, very high grades. On the higher level, the strategic and again, what I call the management level, because here, remember, fighting the war includes managing a very large organization and its resources. And there I give lower grades. In terms of overall planning, in terms of overall orders coming down, and once again, I can understand it without agreeing. The slow pace has been, on the one hand, because we're being methodical. I don't want to go into the limitations that were thrown in politically by administrations, primarily the Biden one, but not exclusively, where the political echelon had to make decisions, but also in the field, a lack of sense of urgency, which is also typical of the IDF after sort of initial impact. We saw the same thing, by the way, in 2006 in the Second Lebanon War with Hezbollah. Time is a commodity. It's something that's not taught well, as far as I could see, in the upper echelons of the IDF. And the sense that, well, we have time to do this is something that we're seeing the results of now, and it's radiating how, once again, manpower, equipment, munitions, and the like, and the fatigue that we've seen. There, I give them much lower grades, if you will, in terms of strategy and management.
Now, one of the things that has struck me, and indeed readers of JNS have sometimes asked me about, is the contrast between how well Israeli intelligence seemed to know what was going on in Lebanon and Iran. As we saw, not just with the pagers, but the fact that they knew the whereabouts of so many, their leadership seemed to be prepared for whatever their next move would be, and always a step ahead. And as a result, achieved enormous success, in Lebanon against Hezbollah and obviously against Iran in that campaign. But at the same time, always seemed to be a step behind when it came to fighting Hamas in Gaza. Not to say that that Hamas beat them, but that Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, which is legendary, is sort of godded up as an organization of James Bonds type people, as well as brilliant tech people. They didn't seem to know much about what Hamas was thinking or what they were going to do in the same way they did about Hezbollah and Iran. What's the explanation for that?
Okay, so first of all, let me just clarify one point here, and that is Gaza is not under the bailiwick of Mossad. It's Shabak, the Shin Bet, and the military. Different organizations with different organizational cultures. Start with that. Second, the failure with Hamas on October 7th was an intelligence failure of a category known as strategic intelligence failure, as opposed to the successes that we saw, by the way, also against Hamas. We're still seeing it, of what you can call tactical or operational intelligence, and there's an enormous difference between them. Strategic intelligence fails, and when it fails spectacularly. Pearl Harbor, the Yom Kippur War, Operation Barbarossa, the surprise German invasion of Russia. I mean, how did the Russians not see 162 German divisions coming at them? And the answer is that they did. Just as in the other cases, The failure is in analysis, not in gathering. And the sort of seminal work on it was a book on Pearl Harbor written in the early 1960s by Roberta Wohlstetter called Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision, where she coined the terms signals and noise. And just a quick summary of a very important book was that Pearl Harbor didn't happen because of lack of information. It happened because of too much information and the inability of the system to sort what was relevant and what wasn't. And I think October 7th falls into the same category. They knew about the SIM cards that Hamas had for Israeli phones. They saw them turned on. In other words, Israeli intelligence saw that they had been turned on around midnight on the night of the 6th, 7th, and they misinterpreted what it was. They saw other things, they misinterpreted them. Now, why that happened, I think that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But once again, it wasn't they didn't have the information, it's that they misread the information and they misassessed the information. Tactical and operational intelligence, and I'm going to leave the beepers aside from them because that's more active operational, but intelligence in terms of knowing who's where and what's what, on all fronts, we're very good at it. Remember, Sinwar was let's say, taking him out was a lucky stroke, but Mohammed Def, Mohammed Sinwar, other leaders, we knew where they were, we knew when they were there, we knew precisely, and we hit them, and that's in Gaza. And of course, Hezbollah, Nasrallah on down, we knew where they were, hit them, took them out, the opening night of the Iran campaign, etc. But this is something the intelligence services do at a very, very high level, and that is when you tell them, this is what you're looking for. When you see it, mark it, they're astoundingly good at it. They're innovative, they're dedicated, and I mean emotionally dedicated. They're professionally dedicated to finding that information, getting it, and identifying it. They're not doing assessment. They're saying, this guy is in this place, he's there now, and our estimate is he's going to be there for another 2 hours. Which is very, very different from, here's a whole bunch of information, what are they going to do with it?
Yeah. Well, speaking of Israel's greatest successes, the campaign against Iran certainly was that. I mean, if you consider that the war that Iran helped started on October 7th has resulted in a disaster for Iran's strategic position with respect to not only just Hamas and in Lebanon, the fall of its Syrian ally as a result of what happened in Lebanon, and the devastation that was wrought on Iran's nuclear program as well as much else. But what do you think about their ability to rebuild and to start up again? Obviously, there's, the United States isn't interested in regime change for, I think, very understandable reasons. So the regime is still there and likely to remain there, unless some domestic opponents somehow find the will to do something about it, which does not seem to be in the offing. What are Iran's chances of rebuilding its effort to wage war against Israel in the West?
The answer to your question is the same as what I said about Hezbollah and perhaps the future of Hamas. Do we permit them to do it? We've been tracking the Iranian nuclear program, and I'm talking about the clandestine military program, since the early mid-1990s. And for a variety of reasons, and I think many of them good, I hate to second-guess decision-making on that level of what to do and when with the consequences. We watched it built over the decades. And as time went on, and here again, I think a combination of bad decision-making on our part, but incrementally bad decision-making, allowing Hezbollah to build up to the strength that it had built up to before we took it out this past year, put us in a position where, in addition to all of the other calculations that had to be made in striking Iran, we had to consider a Hezbollah with, depending on whose numbers you want to believe, 250, 300, 350,000 rockets aimed at Israel with the ability to launch 2,000 or 3,000 a day, was we were deterred as part of that. In other words, you don't know, you don't have certainty about success. You don't know if you're going to be able to launch a prolonged campaign. And on top of it, not only is Iran going to respond, but you're going to be hit by Hezbollah as well. So
yeah, I think what I heard from people over the last few years, I think there were a lot of people within Israel that talked about Hezbollah as if it was invincible. Certainly many in America thought that, as if there was no way Israel could accomplish what it actually has accomplished against
right. So
them.
not so much invincible as able to inflict a huge amount of damage to Israel in the process of us taking them out. And damage, once again, that you don't know what the outcome of a campaign is going to be. You don't know how long it's going to last. They certainly not only had a rocket capability, we know that they had a very strong ground capability. The Radwan forces along the border that were very well trained by Iran, and we've seen some of the results of that. We always knew that with all due disrespect to Hamas and the Nukhba, Hezbollah was a far more dangerous adversary in terms of ground warfare and in terms of what it was capable of doing to Israel. So we permitted all of that to go in the hope that, first of all, and I always say that the first hope, Messiah is going to come and that's going to solve it all. Okay, next, maybe America will see that the danger, after all, is death to Israel, death to America in the same breath. And maybe America will step in and either join us or lead or whatever. Maybe the Iranians will make a mistake. They'll provoke America. There's a lot of wishful thinking built into that because nobody wanted to make the really difficult decision. And once again, I say that not critically, but analytically, nobody wanted to step into that mess. And now suddenly, unplanned, and I would love to see somebody try to convince me otherwise. I think this was a series of events of A leading to B, leading to C, leading to D, and not a grand strategic plan. But Hezbollah got worn down over the year after October 7th, in part because of their decision to maintain a low-intensity war along Israel's northern border. We did a lot of damage to them incrementally without sort of spiking it and turning it into a open warfare on a grand scale until we decided to, with the beepers and the communicators, and we know the outcome. So now suddenly Hezbollah's threat as a retaliatory strike capability for Iran is now off the table. In the immediate aftermath of that, the Assad regime falls. Now, Jolani, I don't think is a friend of ours. I think he's a scrambler, but in the meantime, he has no capability. And that becomes very important because it opens the air corridor between Israel and Iran. At the same time, Iran, in the course of the war, launched multiple missile strikes against Israel. Hundreds of missiles were fired with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, most of which were intercepted by Israel, the United States, others. And we retaliated in both cases, taking out the core of their air defense capability. So now we come to June 13th, the day of the initial strike against Iran, with an almost perfect playing field that simply was inconceivable a year before. And on top of that, hugely successful, once again, intelligence, Mossad operations on the ground in Iran, excellent performance by the Air Force, from the ground crews all the way up through the pilots and back down again. And we get the results that we do. But I want to repeat that even then, when the planes take off on the morning or the night of June 13th, we don't know that that's going to turn into a massive success. As a matter of fact, at 3 a.m. in Israel, the sirens went off all across the country. We had no idea why. And it was done in anticipation of only a partial success in Iran and their potential to retaliate with a massive missile strike back against Israel, which of course didn't happen. But You don't know this until after the reports come in.
Mm. With respect to Syria, which you just mentioned, the Jolani regime is being treated by the Trump administration, and I think to some extent, although not sort of technically on the ground, as we saw with Israel striking into Syria in recent days, but the Netanyahu government has kind of gone along with Trump with respect to the idea that the new government in Syria is a potential partner, maybe even joining the Abraham Accords. How realistic is any of that? I mean, is there any way conceivable for, this regime, which is made up of, former terrorists, former jihadis, going to make peace with Israel at any price, let alone with making them understand that Syria is never going to get the Golan Heights back? Is that, is this just all pie in the sky kind of talk with respect to Syria?
I think it's overly optimistic. I think that where we are from, let me separate the American and the Israeli issue here. America has every reason to play this game. It costs them nothing. I mean, if they've taken off the sanctions, they took the bounty off Jolani's head, but that really doesn't mean anything from an American point of view. If he turns around tomorrow and declares that he's ISIS, you slap him back with the sanctions, you slap him back with the bounty, and it hasn't cost America anything along the way. Maybe a little prestige, but not much. You can always say, we tried. Mm-hmm. For Israel, it becomes it depends. What do you give him? Now, if it's give him a little respect and, and shake his hand and some sort of security negotiation without having to give up anything of irrevocable strategic value, then it's worth a shot, because there again, you say, what does it cost me? If it fails, it might cost something, but the potential for success, even if it's low probability, is certainly worth the effort. What we're seeing today in the last couple of days with the attacks on the Druze community in southwestern Syria, and we've been striking very heavily against the Syrian forces that are massacring Druze right now, apparently on a scale beyond what they did to the Alawites a few months ago. He's claiming that the forces there are not under his command. In other words, they're renegades, but they're Syrian army, which raises an even more important question beyond his will and interest. Who does he control?
Yeah, if he doesn't control the Syrian army, then what's the Syrian government?
Exactly. So, all very good questions. I don't think they're very good answers. The best Israel can do is give it a shot. Don't invest much in the risk, and be prepared for it all to fail. And so far, that's what we're doing. His immediate demand is that we pull out of the positions that we had taken over within Syria, and our answer was very simply no. We're not doing that.
I think Israel should stick to that. We'll see how that develops. My last question is about sort of thinking ahead after a Gaza agreement, assuming one is concluded, whatever its terms. Certainly, the Trump administration would like to get back to the Abraham Accords, expand them, which is in principle, what Israel wants. The Netanyahu government has always viewed not just the expansion of the Abraham Accords, but getting Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel, which would be sort of the crowning jewel in any Abraham Accords expansion, and really be a sea change in the region. How realistic do you think that is? Hasn't the sort of the defeat of Iran reduced the Saudi inclination to take its under-the-table relationship from Israel to an over-the-table one? Hasn't that made it much less likely that the Saudis would risk the blowback that it gets from its own people, from the Arab street, as the guardian of the holy places of Islam, to be recognizing Israel?
Yes, absolutely. Precisely correct. One of the Saudis' considerations over the years was the threat that Iran stood for against the regime. The Iranians would very much like to be the guardians of the holy places. And here there's a Sunni Shiite issue. There's an Arab Persian issue. There are a lot of fault lines in here, not just a simple, I want it and I don't want you to have it. We should keep in mind also that the Saudi regime at its core is Wahhabi, which is a radical Islamic sect in its own right. The Brotherhood,
the alliance with the Wahhabi sect was how the Saud clan took over Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
What we now call Saudi Arabia, but which used to be ruled by a different clan, the Hashemites, who were Britain's allies during World War I, and then wound up, all they've got left is Jordan now.
Jordan, that's right. Look, Ibn Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi sect, married a daughter of a Saud. The entire Saudi royal family are the descendants of Ibn Wahhab. Now, how much is each of them a true believer or a deep believer is an open question. How much do they need to show that they are, at least superficially, the believers, and by virtue of that, worthy of being the custodians of the holy places? Very, very high. When threatened with destruction by Iran, they know how to play realpolitik. That's not a problem for them right now. Keeping in mind, Qatar, by the way, is also Wahhabi, and not a surprise. That's why they're behind a lot of the
sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood as well.
Exactly.
And obviously linked to Hamas as well as to Iran.
Yeah, so the Muslim Brotherhood at its core is not Wahhabi, but it joined up with them during the good old days of Nasser in Egypt, where they left, many of them fled Egypt rather than be executed, ended up in Saudi Arabia, and there was a certain sort of hybridization between the Wahhabis and the Brotherhood. And we're seeing the result of that in terms of the Qatari support for jihadism across the world. So yes, the Saudis are, I think, going to be more conservative. If they're going to go forward with it, they're going to make higher demands of the United States in terms of a payoff, and they're going to need some sort of fig leaf, perhaps in Gaza, to show that they've gotten something out of it that's more than just sort of a feel-good. The region is going to be a quieter place now, thanks to our liberal agreement with Israel. I'm being facetious, of course.
Well, Elliot, thanks so much for joining us and for giving us all your insights in these issues. You can hear more from Elliot Chodoff on the Conflict Uncovered podcast. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all of the podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us live and watching us on any of those podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or on X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org. Let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.